But it's great to be here. I think some people, in terms of Ian and James, were talking about where they started. So I went into RTE as a radio producer in '88. So at the time when independent broadcasting was starting, and really my radio career coincides with this arc of where we've come from. I started in journalism in the Irish Times, trained in typewriters, and I always see my own journey coming from this whole stretch from analogue into digital. And really, since I was in the BBC in the mid-90s as a manager, I've become very, not just an advocate, but very passionate about the opportunities that digital gives us as storytellers, as broadcasters, and really as content makers. And obviously, as all of you know, I was head of radio for a period of 5 years when we were deeply embedded in the digital transformation around all the debates on DAB. And in a sense, after taking a year out, set up Athena Media. And in thinking about this today and in talking to John, I was kind of looking at some of the things that have happened in the last 10 years in my life with Athena Media, because not just have we been making things, but also been involved in some fairly big, as John was saying, consultancy and research studies around media here. So in thinking about the future of Irish media, I always think it's good to think about the past and where we've come from, and that's really been part of what we've done in trying to look at the trends and what's unique about our story here in Ireland, and also how we can learn from outside and what we should improve on. And one of the first things that I was involved in when I set up was what became the Ox Report, which many of you here know as being the study on radio licensing, which came out in 2004. And I think I was asked to the BAI AGM that year to talk about media and futures. And one of the things that I was saying there in 2004, coming from that period of 6 months of research on the Irish media market and the comparative study internationally, was to say that we really need to think about how we thought from policy and regulation and looking at how things were changing, as James was saying, and Ian, from the audience relationship to content, but then looking at how we look at that from the top down, how we create a framework that makes sense of that. And really in 2004, I was saying, maybe we need to think about a media authority and looking at where that was happening in the world. Because if you think back to 2004, we were actually beginning a very long process of what became the 2009 broadcasting legislation. So there was that opportunity where things were up in the air, and the BAI, in a sense, ended up becoming a much bigger, more empowered body and having very distinct new roles. We're still in that discussion about whether now, almost nearly 10 years down the road, we're at the time to look at further combined thinking about content, about broadcasting, and about how we think about it in policy and regulation. Because it's increasingly become strange to think that we're about to make a decision about changing, say, the license fee, which now seems very bizarre. I had to explain this to Americans over the weekend at a gathering about how funding happens as we pay a license fee for every TV set. It is very hard to actually say that and not get a lot of laughter on the other side in this day and age. But in a sense, the logic of what's happening with the switch to the broadcasting charge, by which we know that so many of us are receiving our TV and radio through devices which are mobile phones, laptops, iPads, etc., and not through a box in the corner. So if that's broken down, if the connection between how we consume content has changed and how we relate to content, then everything has changed. So the broadcasting charge change has to really knit into a whole deeper thinking about how we think about broadcasting and more fundamentally content in Ireland. So in some ways, it's interesting that the minister, and he said in the media show, which as you may know we're producing at the moment for RTE Radio 1, he said a couple of weeks ago that the broadcasting charge will be introduced next year. It was interesting today that there was a reference to the need for legislation. So sometimes it's hard to think that legislation will happen in the time span which would see the broadcasting charge taking place by 2014, because as we know, we're still awaiting the media mergers legislation. So in some ways, I think we're at a point where maybe there's a chicken and egg scenario. We can see the need, the absolute broken nature of the connection between funding in terms of public broadcasting and the way that that's working, because it doesn't connect with distribution and how we receive content. But in many ways, we haven't yet had the conversation, which is the much bigger conversation, about how we actually work as a content sector and how we regulate and make policy around that. So in some ways, what I would be suggesting is actually, if we didn't start that some years ago, we really need to start thinking about it now. If new legislation is in the pipeline now, there's such a range of things that have to be put back into the conversation, because as we know, the BAI has no distinct remit over online or the internet, and in a sense, neither does the Press Council. So we have two very distinct forms of press thinking or content thinking in Ireland, but neither of them have a legislative role in terms of content in the internet. And yet, as the Minister himself says, everything is shifted online, not just the content, but the advertisement. So the way we need to think about that requires us to actually pull back a bit and say, how do we make things flow better and reflect what's actually happening in the real world from the top down in policy and regulation? And in some ways, the conversation about advertisement, which has come to the top of the conversation, almost has to fit back into a much larger narrative, because the sums that we're looking at in the picture in internet advertisement in Ireland, and this 12% now, and it's grown very rapidly from the big piece of work that I did for the BAI as a commission in 2010, which was the broadcasting landscape of Ireland. And at that stage, we were literally flagging this very dramatic shift online and the need to make these changes within the way we constructed our content society, and particularly broadcasting. So we're now at 150 million. It's growing rapidly. We know that now. We see the impact of mobile advertisement. And yet what we also know is that that advertisement is not an actual displacement from what was spent in broadcasting or in print in Ireland, because in most sectors, 2/3, 50% of advertisement that goes into online is going into what we call search, Google, Facebook. So in some ways, the thing that I would put back into the conversation is not just the need to pull back to think big and say, do we need a media authority? Do we need to think about content before the boxes into which we put content, whether radio, television, or online? But also, do we need to not think about coming more together and reflecting that in this small island, this small community, particularly in the Republic of 4.5 million people, actually all the content makers have far more in common and far more to lose as a combined force. Because if you look at the trends, not only are we competing with those 34 channels in television, not only are we competing online, but actually the shift in advertisement is not just a clean one from RTE, TV3, Communicore, or from local radio. It's shifting and diffusing, and actually it's going into places like Google or Facebook, which doesn't come back to the content creation companies that we are representing here or representing in terms of the online publishers in Ireland. So you have to think about what are the mechanisms in which we can think more constructively. And one of the most useful and really inspiring things I heard this morning was the idea of actually a forum. We need to find ways, as John was saying, where we don't actually interact just through megaphone diplomacy. Articles in the Irish Times, there seem to have been a lot of them lately. There's obviously this anticipation for this RTE public value report coming out. We've just had the PwC one issued by RTE. There's a lot of things being put out in terms of an advocacy and lobbying debate, and that's perfectly fine in terms of our democratic engagement. But yeah, wouldn't it be great if there was more spaces in which we had a combined Irish media, Irish content thinking around this, where we actually had a forum, where we actually had meetings and interaction, engagement. And I suppose one of the gaps that really struck me this morning in even looking at this was that James was able to pull from a lot of research from the UK. Rayjar, over the last many years, since 2005, 2006, is publishing on its website regularly exactly what's happening with online digital. You can see incredibly clear trend-based research showing where the money is going, where the audience is going, and how people are reacting. We're not seeing that when you go to our research. It's actually quite hard in Ireland to get very detailed and very accurate research about what's happening. We can see from the figures last week how many people are listening to radio every day, and it's a brilliant story. But we do know it's falling. We do know from all of the sidebar research that independent stations are doing, or independent research is doing, what's happening, and particularly the big shift in the under-30s and their habits. But one of the things I'd really be encouraging into that conversation of combined thinking is combined research, really hopefully under the auspices of something like the BAI and the regulator, and obviously seeing that as that's worth investing in. Combined thinking, combined research, and actually the tools by which we can create a more constructive approach to this disruptive change, but also the fact that disruption and destruction creates things, and how can we create a forward and future-focused media sector in Ireland.
Thanks, Helen. Thank you very much.